When we think true crime stories, we tend to think justice happens in the big moments, the grand gestures. A lead detective at a killer's front door, ready to make the big arrest. All of it culminating into the biggest, most fateful moment of all, when the jury announces their verdict. Guilty or not guilty. But tonight's episode is about a case that would come down to the most granular of details. And there won't be one lone hero behind this mystery, but a literal army of people willing to move heaven and earth to find out what happened to an aspiring model who just landed her big break, only to vanish, disappear, out of the picture without a trace. A case that began in 1996 and is still making headlines as of last week, January 2026. This is a story of desperate desires and dangerous delusions, all told with exhaustive, deleterious detail. Because this is a very special episode of Dead Sleep, a Forensic Files Flashback. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator and host of Dead Sleep and a longtime fan of Forensic Files. I've been falling asleep to it for years. And now that I have my own podcast, I have the opportunity to pay tribute to that series with my own Dead Sleep rendition of the long-running true crime insomniac's best friend. Now, I think I've done maybe 4 or 5 Forensic Files homages in the past, and I heard from a lot of people who really enjoyed my treatment of Forensic Files, so I thought it would be of great use, potentially, to devote an entire month to Forensic Files in a February Forensic Files Flashback. So this month will be a total of 3 episodes, 2 free episodes and 1 bonus, where I revisit an old episode from the original Forensic Files series and transform it into a suitable bedtime-style story, optimized for nighttime listening. Now, I'll link to the original episode that you're going to hear about tonight. It's called Concrete Alibi. Of course, in the Dead Sleep version of events, there's no depictions of violence, no gore, and as always, no ads. If you like what you hear and would like to support this podcast and enjoy bonus episodes, you can become a subscriber for about $5 a month via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. And real quick, a special thank you to the band Robots in the Sun for this Forensic Files-inspired original score, which includes tracking down the 1990s era synth sound used in the original music for Forensic Files. Now let's get into the story. Where tonight's story begins, well, it's the way so many tragedies do. With a pretty girl with big dreams in a small town. The town here was in rural Illinois, just outside of Decatur, and the young woman, she was 23-year-old Karen Hearn Slover. And her big dream? Well, it was to be a professional model. And sure, that's a dream many young women have. But on September 27th, 1996, it seemed, at long last, Karen's dream was actually coming true. Karen worked for a local newspaper in Decatur, Illinois. Decatur is located roughly a 3-hour drive south of Chicago. Decatur is a small but historically noteworthy city, as evidenced by the giant statues of its most famous resident, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's family set up a homestead in that area back in the 1830s. Though Lincoln, he moved around a lot in Illinois. So there are about as many statues of Lincoln in Illinois as there are Paul Revere slept here signs in Massachusetts or original raised pizzas in New York City. But one of the statues in Decatur depicts Abe as a vibrant young man. And this giant bronze statue kind of looks like it could be a Levi's commercial, circa 1830. A tussle-haired, 21-year-old Abe, casually but nobly perched on a log. A stack of books on one side, an axe on the other. And it was here, in Decatur, where Lincoln came as a young man to forge his future. But flash forward to 1996, and 23-year-old Karen, she was ready to leave Decatur to start a new life of her own. And whether she knew it or not, she was following a bit of Abe Lincoln's most sage advice. Leave nothing for tomorrow, which can be done today. And on that day, September 27th, 1996, Karen ran around her office, sharing the exciting news with everyone. She'd just heard from her modeling agency, and she'd booked a job, a real job, her first modeling job. The first of many to come, she hoped. With her blonde hair and cheerleader-friendly smile, Karen's look is what a modeling agent might describe as commercial. At 23 years old, Karen understood she wasn't destined for couture shows on the runways. But she'd signed with a modeling agency based in Georgia, and it seemed she had potential to make a lucrative living doing catalogs, bridal magazines, assuming, of course, this modeling agency was legitimate. She'd found out about this agency in the classified ads, which to her wasn't a red flag. This was an interesting time, the dawn of the internet, where it wasn't unusual for people to still look at the newspaper to find job opportunities. And it turned out, Karen, she worked in ad sales at the local Decatur newspaper. And if she sold ads that ran in the back of the classifieds, what would be wrong with answering one? The modeling agency was located in Savannah, Georgia, but the name of the agency suggested it had global aspirations. The agency was called Paris International. And their business model, it sounded a little sketchy. Aspiring models actually paid the agency to have their photos listed on the Paris International website. And it was from there that potential clients would find those photos, then book the girls from the website. So what kind of modeling job it was, what brand it might be for, her coworkers that day, they didn't know. All they knew was that Karen was very excited. and she left at 5 o'clock, nearly on the dot. She had a lot to do. This included 2 pickups. One was picking up a new dress at the mall, and the other was picking up her favorite person in the world. He was, without question, the love of her life. And after 3 years of being patient and enduring an undue amount of toxicity, after this long wait, it was time to take him and herself away from these toxic relationships and forge a new life together. So as Karen sped away that evening from her office, if things went according to plan, Karen's days at the newspaper, they were over. But things didn't go according to plan. In Karen's newspaper days, they were just beginning. Her name would soon be in all of the headlines. Karen Hearn Slover was missing. It was 10 o'clock that Friday night when a police officer happened upon a car. And as he drew closer, he could see the driver's side door was wide open. An initial logical assumption would be someone was having car trouble, and they'd just open the door to check things out. But when he pulled over to get a closer look, maybe offer some help, he noticed the car engine was on. The rumble of that engine low and steady. The inside of the car, it was noticeably disheveled. Somewhere on the seat, there was a woman's purse and a half-eaten candy bar. Inside the purse was a wallet, no ID. They noted the license plate and found out the car wasn't registered in a woman's name, but it belonged to a 34-year-old man named David Swan. Soon after they had a name, they reached out to David Swan. And when the police told him his car had been found abandoned along a bridge in a completely different county, about 40 miles away from where his car was registered, he was stunned. He had no idea what had happened. He lent his car to his new girlfriend. Her name was Karen Hearn Slover. Though technically, she wasn't Slover anymore. She and her husband, Michael, they'd gotten divorced. They'd only been dating a few weeks, he said, but they knew each other before that. David also worked at the newspaper. And when they asked him where he was that Friday night, he said he was at a rehearsal dinner for an upcoming wedding. He told police he was aware that she was going to Georgia for this modeling job, but he offered to lend her his car that evening so she could run some errands. And he hadn't seen her since. The police knew the next 48 hours were critical and worked quickly to figure out where she'd come from, where she was headed, and who was the last person who saw her. Karen's ex-husband was naturally on the top of their list. Where was he that Friday night? And when was the last time he spoke with Karen? Michael said he hadn't seen Karen that night. He worked Friday nights as a bouncer at a local bar. But Karen and Michael, they had a 3-year-old son, Christopher. And that Friday, Michael's parents, they babysat Christopher. And Karen was supposed to pick him up, but she never showed. A visit to Michael's parents confirmed Michael's story. He did work that night, and they'd stayed in, like they always did, eating pork chops for dinner, watching TV, babysitting their little grandson, waiting for Karen to arrive. Karen's own parents, especially her father, Larry, he feared the worst, that she'd been kidnapped. And one logical train of thought was looking at the one thing that Karen was doing that was out of her routine: the modeling job. Could there be some connection to that modeling job in Georgia? Maybe someone who'd contacted her from the Paris International Modeling Agency. But a quick look into that agency, and it didn't add up. If this agency was shady, then something would have likely happened when she'd reached Georgia. There was no connection to that agency here in Illinois. As police retraced Karen's steps that night, things became even more confusing. Where Karen was supposed to be that night, and where that car was found, it made no geographical sense. Like Karen, Michael and his parents lived near Decatur, a quick drive from her office. But where the abandoned car was found, with the motor running, that was a good distance away, nearly an hour's drive south of Decatur, which would mean she was traveling in the opposite direction of where she was supposed to be, which now made their search twice as big and twice as challenging. The obvious question was why? Where was she going? And with whom? Shelby County, where the car was found, was even more rural than Decatur. And Shelby County was best known around the state for its lake, Lake Shelbyville. Lake Shelbyville is a massive, man-made reservoir built by the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1960s. A popular summer destination for boating, fishing, swimming, though of course by late September, in central Illinois, it wasn't summer anymore. The crowds were gone, though careless vacationers never failed to leave their garbage behind for the locals to have to pick up. And on September 29th, a local noticed a big, ugly blue plastic trash bag that had bobbed along the water, then washed its way to shore. But a closer look at the contents of that bag revealed it was not a piece of trash. And someone made an urgent call to the police. Once authorities opened the bag, it was devastatingly obvious this was the woman they were looking for. And Karen Hearn Slover, she was no longer a missing person, but a victim of what was, without question, a violent homicide. And while they didn't know the killer's name, not his identity, not yet, they did know this person was a vile, cruel coward. Someone so weak They couldn't even point a gun at Karen to her face, because whoever did this, they'd shot Karen, a 23-year-old woman, a girl practically, when her back was turned. She'd been shot in the back of the head at least 5 times. That bag was just the first of several trash bags containing the remains of Karen Hearn Slover. Who could hate Karen so much that they not only killed her, they then decided to destroy her memory by reducing her into individual pieces of trash. Just 2 days after her disappearance, and the police, they had no idea. But rest assured, this being Forensic Files, they would leave no actual stone unturned to find out. She liked everybody. Everybody liked her. Who could do such a bizarre thing? That is all Larry Hearn, Karen's father, could think about. The same could be said for the police. Veteran homicide detectives, county sheriffs, who said they'd never seen anything like it. Carnage, said one cop. He woke up thinking about it. He went to bed thinking about it. He dreamed about it. Had nightmares about it. And there were all manner of theories about who this person was. Some believed it might be a serial killer, a pervert, one of the cops said. As they interviewed people and went to various locations, they didn't know where Karen went and what happened, but they could at least get a sense of where she wasn't and what didn't happen. For instance, she never made it to the mall, and she never went to pick up her son. They knew she was last seen at the newspaper offices. They knew the car she was driving ended up along a deserted interstate. But her remains, they ended up in Lake Shelbyville. But police didn't believe she was killed there, not in Shelbyville. So the county cops closer to Decatur, they took the case, leading the investigation, as authorities in Shelby County assisted in processing the evidence found along the lake, whatever was found in and around those trash bags. Around the trash bags, they discovered they'd been sealed with duct tape. When the duct tape was removed and forensically examined, they were disappointed to learn that not a single one of those pieces of duct tape or the bags contained fingerprints. Everything that could possibly lead them to a suspect, it seemed, had been washed away. Then, while examining one of the final bags and the final pieces of tape, they discovered the best and really only forensic lead. They found 6 thin black hairs stuck to one of the pieces of duct tape. If they could get these hairs analyzed, perhaps identify some mitochondrial DNA, that could lead them directly to Karen's killer. This was, however, the mid-1990s. So access to DNA testing in criminal cases like this, it was relatively rare and the cost was astronomical, especially for a small county in Illinois. But these 6 dark hairs, wherever they came from, whoever they belonged to, they would need to find out. But that would take some time. Meanwhile, investigators dug a little deeper into this whole serial killer twisted pervert theory. This included having an FBI profiler look at the case and develop a criminal profile of what kind of killer they were looking for. And this expert told them, the person you are looking for wasn't some homicidal drifter, but quite possibly someone from the community whose darkest impulses were hidden inside a person who appeared completely normal. Someone you might sit next to in church, the expert said, and have no idea what they were really capable of. So investigators took a second look at those closer to Karen's inner circle. This included Karen's ex-husband, Michael Jr., who had dark hair. Could those strands on the duct tape be his? But it seemed impossible. His alibi was airtight. Michael had worked all day doing security at a supermarket, then taught a karate class in the early evening, then went to his Friday night job as a bouncer at a bar. Nearly every minute of that day was accounted for. It was physically impossible for him to be behind this. And Michael's parents swore they hadn't seen their son that night, nor had they seen Karen. They'd stayed inside as they always did. They had pork chops for dinner, watched something on PBS, and took care of Christopher. A search of his parents' house, where Karen was supposedly headed that night, it didn't reveal anything suspicious. So police looked at another man, one who was closest to Karen, at least romantically, at that time. Karen's new love interest, David Swan, whom she met at work. David's hair was blonde, so whatever strands were on that duct tape didn't belong to him. But as they looked more closely into his background, they discovered there were troubling details about his past. Run-ins with the law, including one incident where David indulged in some disturbing delusion that he believed, or at least he pretended, that he was a member of law enforcement. He'd posed as a cop and gotten caught. Detectives also learned of a particular incident in David's past that might have a clear and chilling connection to Karen's murder. There were photos of David holding a rifle and wearing camouflaged hunting gear. They learned David was fond of hunting, especially deer, which was perfectly legal in Illinois. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what they discovered David did one time after he killed the deer. Detectives learned David had, shall we say, broken down this large deer into smaller sections, removing sections of that deer's remains with a chainsaw. And police couldn't help but draw a direct connection to the process of doing that to a deer, to the post-mortem condition of Karen's remains. They also took a closer look at David's alibi. He told him he was at a friend's wedding rehearsal, which included a rehearsal dinner. This was true. But they learned from one of the fellow guests that David was indeed at the rehearsal on time, but then he disappeared. only to show up late to the rehearsal dinner at a local restaurant. When detectives did the math on his timeline, they realized there was a 45-minute window in David's timeline that could not be accounted for. With his background in chainsaws and that shaky alibi, Macon County authorities were confident this was their guy. But what would be his motive? David was aware of Karen's big dream of moving to Georgia for her modeling career. But maybe he just thought it was a pipe dream and didn't worry about it, not when they first started dating. But then she booked the modeling job. And that was the first sign that this dream had the potential to become reality. Detectives wondered if this suddenly threatened David, and when they brought him in for questioning, he continued to deny having anything to do with it. But they kept at it for 6 months. Where were you for those 45 minutes from the rehearsal to that dinner? And finally, with that pressure, they got a break. David said he finally remembered. He was late to the dinner because he went to an ATM, a drive-through bank. That's where he was for those 45 minutes. He swore it. 6 months after Karen's murder, police were able to find proof. They found a copy of a security tape that showed, indeed, David was where he said he was, at that ATM. He was not their killer, which was good news for David Swan. Bad news for police. They'd spent a lot of time looking at him as a suspect, and now they were back to where they started. They knew where she was the beginning of that evening. She left the newspaper, and they knew where she was at the end, the grim discovery in Shelbyville. So now they needed to focus on the middle, the abandoned car along the road. They didn't believe she was killed there, but it was the closest thing they had to a crime scene. They revisited what was found inside the car: her purse, half of a candy bar, and a smattering of debris on the driver's side, near the gas pedal, of what looked like pieces of concrete. Back in Shelbyville, authorities had discovered that along with Karen's remains in those trash bags, someone had tried to weigh the bags down with sizable chunks of concrete. Of course, it hadn't worked, and her remains had risen to the surface of the water. But was there a way to connect the concrete in this car with the concrete found inside those trash bags? And if so, where did this concrete come from? What if Karen was nowhere near this interstate that night? What if someone drove her car alone and abandoned it to throw off the police? But if that were true, that person wouldn't have left the car and walked away. They would have had to have help, which meant there wasn't just one suspect. They realized they were now looking for 2 possible killers. Indeed, at the scene where the car was found, there was evidence of 2 sets of tire tracks along that road, which suggested one person drove the car, and there was another car just behind with another person inside, and then the 2 took off together. Certainly this clarified the crime scene, but it was now a whole new layer of complications. Now there were 2 people who wanted Karen dead. And things were about to get even more confusing. They'd gotten the results back. The hairs on that duct tape. And well, those hairs didn't belong to David Swan or Michael Jr. or anyone they'd interviewed. Those hairs didn't even belong to a human. Those hairs were dog hairs, determined to belong to a large breed of dog, possibly a black Labrador retriever. One of the most popular, if not the most popular breed of dog in the United States. There were thousands of black labs likely in Illinois. Tracking down the exact dog whose fur ended up on this duct tape it would take a miracle. Miracle Motors was a used car lot located in Mount Zion, a small village in Illinois, roughly 10 miles away from Decatur. And Miracle Motors, well, it had one thing in common with the Paris International Modeling Agency. Its name was an aspirational misnomer. Most would say there was nothing miraculous about this place that was filled with more junk than actual cars. But for police who'd been investigating the murder of Karen Slover for 2 years, Miracle Motors proved to be hallowed ground. Because Miracle Motors was where they encountered a black lab named Cassie. Cassie was one of 2 guard dogs, junkyard dogs they called them, who guarded the property. Find the dog, find the killers. And the police believed they'd found that dog, that it was Cassie's fur that found its way on that duct tape, suggesting that this place, Miracle Motors, was where Karen was murdered. Which meant whoever owned Miracle Motors had something to do with Karen's murder. And the owners of Miracle Motors, it was discovered they only lived less than a mile away. And when the police came to their door, they appeared to be the unlikeliest of suspects. An older couple in their 50s who rarely went out socially. They described themselves as real homebodies. And what were they doing Friday, September 27th, 1996? Well, they were probably doing what they always did. Enjoying pork chops for dinner, watching TV, and doting on their little grandson, Christopher. The name of this couple was Paulette and Michael Slover. That's Michael Sr., better known as the parents of Michael Slover Jr. But in the eyes of police, they were the killers of their ex-daughter-in-law, Karen. They didn't believe for 1 second that on September 27th, 1996, Paulette and Michael Sr. were just at home, enjoying a nice dinner, watching Masterpiece Theater, and babysitting their grandson. They believed Paulette and Michael Sr. had somehow lured Karen to go to their used car lot, Miracle Motors, and it was there they murdered her And of all of the lies that the Slovers would tell, there was one thing that was absolutely true. They did dote on little Christopher. Or maybe a better word was obsess over Christopher. Especially Paulette. From the day that child was born, Paulette apparently fixated on Christopher. But being an indulgent grandmother wasn't enough. Paulette saw herself as Christopher's real mother, even claiming at one point that she, 51-year-old Paulette, had breastfed Christopher, her grandson, when he was an infant. Just how much Karen knew about her mother-in-law's bizarre behavior, it wasn't clear. But Karen did know that her mother-in-law was obsessed with Christopher. Karen was not happy about this toxic dynamic. There were times when Karen would go to pick up her own son and have to wrench him out of the arms of Paulette. The last straw was no doubt when Karen told a friend she overheard Paulette saying to baby Christopher, "One day," she said, "you'll be all mine." But she didn't realize how much of a threat she was to Paulette until one day, her big dream, it collided with Paulette's twisted delusion. Just before her murder, Karen had shared the news about her modeling and revealed her long-term plans to relocate to Georgia. Karen had primary custody of Christopher, and Christopher would be going with her, which meant if they wanted to see Christopher outside of, say, the holidays or arranged visits, they'd have to come to Georgia. Michael Jr., Karen's ex-husband, was not known to be a good guy. He'd been physically abusive to Karen while they were married, and based on his past behavior, there was little chance he would ever gain custody of Christopher, unless something happened to Karen. So that night, police believed went something like this. Karen excitedly drove to the Slovers to gather up the love of her life. That's her son. That was Christopher. And she would extract him from that toxic relationship. And they'd make plans of how they were going to go to Georgia and get a fresh start. But she never made it to the house. Instead, somehow Paulette and her husband arranged for Karen to go to Miracle Motors. And it was there they ambushed her, aiming a gun at Karen and shooting her in the back of the head over and over until the gun ran out of bullets. Once she was dead, they went to work, figuring out a way to dispose of Karen's body, filling one trash bag after another, mixing her remains with heavy chunks of concrete found on the lot. It was an attempt to weigh down each bag so it would sink to the bottom. But their efforts, of course, failed. But those failed efforts with the concrete, it could yield great evidence in this case. So authorities decided to take samples of the concrete found inside the trash bags, along with samples of concrete found at Miracle Motors, and send them to a unique team of experts, forensic geologists. These forensic geologists were tasked with answering one important question. Could they determine if these samples came from the Slovers' car lot? As described in Forensic Files, the geologists placed both samples into a scanning electron microscope and hit it with high-energy radiation, which enabled these experts to magnify each sample up to 5,000 times their actual size. When zoomed in up close, these concrete samples, they look like the surface of the moon. And the experts could determine by the shapes and patterns on these surfaces that these concrete samples were indeed alike. Then, the team ground up the samples into a fine powder and then bombarded those samples with X-rays to identify the chemical makeup of the samples. And they determined the chemical makeup in both samples, they were similar enough to raise suspicions, what they called a high level of consistency. So they could connect the cement in the trash bag to the cement found on the property, which was good, but nowhere near enough. In a case that was relying completely on circumstantial evidence, they needed some kind of evidence that placed Karen at Miracle Motors on the day of her murder. But the size of the lot and the mountainous scale of debris, it was a daunting task. One police couldn't do alone. They needed an army. So they enlisted the actual army, members of the military, who came to help remove all of the topsoil and debris from the Slover's 5,000 square foot lot, a process that took many people and many months. Digging, scraping, sorting, filling 60 six-gallon buckets with what looked like chunky dirt. After the buckets were filled, the team then spent 6 months painstakingly sorting through each bucket, sifting through the debris like they were sifting flour through a mesh screen the size of a car hubcap. What they were looking for was any type of clue, a piece of something that would potentially prove Karen was brought to that lot. They didn't know what it would be, so this wasn't the kind of thing a machine could do. It had to be done by people. People who were dedicated enough to keep looking for something they didn't even know existed. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Nothing. Then, like panning for gold, someone spotted a shiny object. A copper-colored button with writing on it. The writing on it was some kind of brand name. That copper button, it belonged on a pair of jeans. The same jeans owned and worn by Karen Slover. The same jeans she was wearing when she was found. Soon after, another nugget of evidence, a cloth-covered plastic button, the kind worn on a woman's blouse. Once again, a forensic team took the button and compared it to the one found on the sleeve on Karen's body. They studied each button under the microscope, doing a side-by-side comparison of the two buttons and the weave pattern, until it was obvious. They too were a match. Then finally, they needed to compare the dog hair DNA found on that duct tape with the dog hair that belonged to one of the Slover's dogs. Of the 6 hairs they collected, only 1 hair could be used for testing. But they were able to conclude that the DNA was likely a match. After 2 years of this investigation, the police charged all three, Paulette, her husband Michael, and Michael Jr., Karen's ex-husband, with first-degree murder. As for Michael Jr., despite his airtight alibi, phone records revealed Michael Jr. had called his parents nearly a dozen times that Friday and over the weekend of Karen's murder. And police believed he played a role in planning her murder and later disposing of the evidence. The motive? The fear that Karen was going to leave and they'd never see Christopher again. Police could now prove that the Slovers told Karen to meet them at that car lot, not the house. And when she arrived, Paulette walked up behind Karen, shooting her multiple times. Then, during the gruesome process of disposing of her remains and putting them in the trash bags, along with that concrete, the button of her jeans and one from her blouse fell on the ground. But the property was so messy they didn't see. Nor did they notice the dog hair that was stuck to that duct tape when they were wrapping up the trash bags. Then they drove her car and the family's pickup to Lake Shelbyville and dumped her remains in the lake. Then they drove to that spot on the interstate and left her car there, running. In 2002, the three were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. And that is where the story ends. Or at least that's where the Forensic Files episode ends. But the case itself continued. 30 years, it's a long time. And in prison, 30 years is an eternity. And during those 30 years, since the murder of Karen Slover, some things had changed. Other things hadn't. And one thing that stayed the same was the Slover family's insistence. They were innocent. All three received lengthy sentences. And they spent most of their time incarcerated, fighting to find a way out. And after years of trying, they finally did manage to find someone willing to revisit their case. A legal aid organization known as the IIP, the Illinois Innocence Project. Most of us are likely familiar with this type of organization, a nonprofit that offers legal services to the countless individuals who were convicted of crimes they did not commit. Nearly all Innocence Project cases rely on the testing of DNA evidence. And a lot has changed in that arena since Karen's death in 1996, when their only biological evidence at that time was a few strands of dog hair. Now, there are tools to identify an individual from a cluster of 15 cells. So, about a decade ago, attorneys working for the Slovers revisited the trash bags and duct tape found in Lake Shelbyville. And they discovered not all traces of human DNA had been washed away. In the samples they tested, the Slovers' legal team said they found previously undetected DNA from 3 unknown males. The lawyers requested these DNA samples be entered into CODIS, the criminal database, to see if there might be a match on one or all 3 of these samples. The Slovers' legal team argued identifying these 3 men would turn this entire case upside down and potentially prove the Slover family was innocent. And after years of battling this out in the courts, this case was reconsidered in 2024, with the defense presenting their case in a recent hearing in late January of this year. That's 2026. With the next hearing in a matter of days from now, February 13th, 2026, where it could be decided, or at least inch closer to deciding, if this DNA can be uploaded to CODIS with a search to find a match. And if they do get a hit on even one of those DNA samples, if those samples match an individual with a criminal background, the Slovers legal team would argue their clients should be exonerated. Of course, those who prosecuted the Slovers years ago, they think they got it right. And they intend to fight any request to have this DNA uploaded to CODIS. And again, that court date that could decide whether or not that happens is scheduled for mid-February, about a week from when I'm recording this. And therefore, if appropriate, I will share an update. But any justice for Paulette and Michael Sr. will once again be a miracle. Both Paulette and Michael died in prison a few years ago. As for Michael Jr., he served his time and was recently released on parole. His desire, he says, is to clear his family's name. As for Christopher, Karen's son, well, he's now an adult. He has a different name and reportedly prefers to lead a private life. But for years, when he was a child, a custody battle between the Slover family and Karen's family played out in public. In the end, Karen's parents ultimately raised Christopher. And they did so as devoted grandparents, nothing more, nothing less. And ensured he understood that his mother, his real mother, Karen, she loved him. And he always was and would forever be hers. Until next time, nighty-night.